He is the bread of life, the way, the truth, and the life. He is the true vine, the light of the world, the good shepherd, and the door. He is the resurrection and the life. He is I am.
Morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good? Yeah? Awesome. Glad you're here. I'm not Pastor Jeremy. I'm a pinch hitter. So Pastor Jeremy and his family have COVID in their house. And so they're doing okay. They're doing okay. He tested positive. A couple of girls might have, but they're all doing fine. But he hopes you understand why he's not here. Pastor Jeremy likes to share. He's a good sharer, but not in that regard. So cross-cultural experiences are fun. I have a friend of mine who tells a story when he was in South America and he was speaking to a group of folks. He was talking about an event in his life and he used the expression, blew my socks off. Now, when you're speaking and you're using a verbal translator, you typically pause every 2 to 3 sentences so the translator can speak what you're saying. So it says you have this back and forth as you progress through your talk. You have this back and forth between, like, you say a couple sentences and you pause. Well, this translator took an extra long time to talk about the idea my friend had just covered. Anyway, when he was done, he talked to one of the bilingual Americans who were there who understood the idiom he had used and the figure of speech. And he asked, what took so long for that translator to try to he said, here's the deal. He said he was lost trying to explain how your socks exploded off your feet, but you weren't burned and you still have your feet. And so that figure of speech, blew my socks off, didn't translate well in that culture. I was overseas a few years ago and I was eating in someone's house and they were serving sardines in this sauce with some sides. It was fairly horrible. It was probably one of the worst things I've ever eaten. But coming from the Midwest and being with the Iowa Nice, being raised in Iowa Nice culture, I ate everything on my plate. And as soon as I finished, the mom scooped up some more and put it on my plate. And I was like, oh no, I cannot stomach another plate of this stuff. I could not put it down. But again, my Iowa Nice kicked in. I muscled it down and cleaned my plate. And then she did it again the third time. I kid you not. I looked at that plate and I was like, I'm done. I cannot muscle it a third time. I just cannot. And inside of my head, I just had to let that food sit inside my head. I'm like, oh, I'm being so rude here. She just dished up this stuff on my plate, and I don't call it food, but she dished up this stuff on my plate, and then it was so bad. I was like, I'm being so rude, and I kept thinking, what would my mom think? She'd think I'd be so rude, and I just kept thinking, and finally, when I got back to where I was staying, I asked the guy I was staying with, I said, what happened here? I told him, he said, well, over here, he said, the cultural procedures, if you finish your plate, you want more. But if you leave some on your plate, you're finished. And so I was like, dude, you couldn't have told me that. I wouldn't have muscled down 2 plates of that. Our passage today has a cross-cultural encounter. And there's a video series out called The Chosen. And right now, The Chosen just shows this encounter so well. So we're going to watch this clip of The Chosen. For whatever reason, Jesus is gaining too much attention in Judea, and he decides to leave. He decides to split. Most Jews on their way to Galilee, as they're heading north, they would go around Samaria. Jesus goes right through it. There's two and probably more than two, but there's at least two glaring cultural clashes that we encounter in this story that even the Samaritan woman picks up on it early on, and the disciples, we'll see here in a second, pick up on it. The feud that was between the Jews and Samaritans, they went back a long way from Jesus' time. It probably started in the days of the patriarchs, but for the sake of time, we go back to 1 Kings 12, when Jeroboam changed the worship of the Israelites. Now, the Israelites were the 10, you might think of Israelites like all of Israel, but at this point in time, Solomon, his sons, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, had split the kingdom. And after Solomon died, into the 10 northern tribes, which was called Israel, and in the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, which was called Judah. Now, Israel would be carried away later because of their false worship, which Jeroboam had started. And God had sent prophet after prophet after prophet to warn them that this was going to happen, that they were going to be punished. There were consequences for sin. And they just would not listen to God. And so the Assyrians came down from the north, and they took the 10 northern tribes, and they took them into captivity. And over time, those particular Jewish folks intermarried with the Assyrians, which is why the Jews called them half-breeds. Now, the Samaritans were also a thorn in the Jews' side when they were trying to rebuild Jerusalem in Ezra 4 and Nehemiah 4. So the animosity was not one-sided. It wasn't just the Jews' problem. They hated the Samaritans for no reason. The Samaritans also hated the Jews, and this feud went back. And two parties both contributed equally to the chasm that existed between them. So not only did they have different systems of worship, but the Samaritans also recognized only the books of Moses. And so the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and really only their version of that was right. So they had come up with their own version. So not only did they have an entirely different system of worship, they also had a different epistemology. So in other words, where they go for truth. Now, the difference on paper seems pretty petty in our culture, but we have to shift our thinking a bit when we look at the stories of the Bible and when we look at history. We have to understand that these were written in a tribal society. Individualism in a tribal society is not a value. Now, we teach our kids that they can be anything they want to be. They can do anything they want to do. My son is a senior in high school. He is graduating this spring. His plans right now, he accepted his offer at Iowa State University in their engineering department. Okay? We have told Caden all along he can do whatever he wants to do. That's what he chooses to do. In a tribal system, those aren't values. A tribal system, your vocation is chosen for you based on what your dad did or based on what's best for the tribe. In a tribal system, you don't pick who you marry. That's done for you, for the better of your tribe. So that your identity is found in your tribe, not in your individual self. So when we watch these Disney and DreamWorks movies of the little Middle Eastern girl or boy who leaves the family to strike out on their own, it's a big, fat lie, right? That is cultural appropriation at its finest. You can look at your kiddo while you're watching and go, that is a lie, and it's disrespectful to those cultures to think that we can impose our Western rugged individualism on their tribal culture. You don't have to say that to them, but you can just say it's a lie. Like, that's not how tribes work. It's not how tribes work. And in the melting pot or tossed salad or whatever we are in America, it looks pretty petty to hate these folks based on these things. Or does it? I don't know, I think we've hated folks for less, and if you think about it in your own life personally, you've probably hated folks for less too. But in this culture that Jesus is in, those were big deals. These were not things that were overlooked. And while they share a similar heritage, the betrayal and hatred drove them to create 2 very different cultures that by Jesus' time were just entirely distinct from one another. And Jesus, instead of going around Samaria like every other Jew, goes right through it. He intentionally crosses cultural lines, just not caring about it. Now, another culture clash Jesus steps into without a care in the world is this cross-gender interaction. Not only is the woman a Samaritan, newsflash, she is a woman. Now, Middle East culture back then and even today does not have a history of elevating the status of women. In Jesus' time would have been no different than it is today for women in many Middle Eastern cultures. Now, there are some countries even today where women are not allowed out of the house until after sunset. So at least this Jewish Samaritan culture wasn't like that. But if you think I'm exaggerating the issue, look at John 4:27. And it described Jesus had sent the disciples into town to get some food. And the disciples are coming back in John 4:27, and he says, just then the disciples returned and were surprised to see him talking to a woman. I'm not exaggerating the issue. This was not a normal thing. But again, Jesus just doesn't care. And rather than give in to that cultural mess, he elevates the status of women by not only engaging her in a life-changing conversation, but allowing her to be used by God to bring her entire village to meet the Messiah. A couple of weeks ago, Pastor Jeremy talked about insiders and how insiders like Nicodemus need Jesus. The Samaritan woman is definitely not an insider. She's not getting water with the other women in the village, and she has clearly led a life full of shame, at least in her tribal system. This woman is an outsider. Now, we saw how Jesus teaches us to interact with insiders in his interaction with Nicodemus. But what do you think we'll learn about interacting with outsiders? Let's take a look. First, Jesus starts with where she and he are at. He's thirsty, and she has water. Now, we would be mistaken to overlook this simple request that Jesus makes of her. He uses where they are to build a relationship to have a more meaningful conversation. But he doesn't start weird, right? Like, I know it can be strange to strike up a conversation with someone about anything, especially with a stranger. But then again, it's super weird to strike up a conversation about your faith with a stranger, right? But it doesn't have to be weird. It can be as natural as this interaction here. Now, this woman picks up on the culture clash we talked about earlier. She says, how can you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan, and a woman? We talked about this a minute ago. Not only did Samaritans and Jews not get along, but anything a Samaritan touched was considered unclean. Therefore, if a Jew touched it, that person became ritualistically unclean. So Jesus was putting himself in a position where he would become ritualistically unclean by Jewish standards. But again, Jesus just doesn't care. And he essentially ignores her question and segues into a meaningful conversation on living water. Now, here they are. They're out in a desert place. Water is a rarity, and water rights are a very real problem. And Jesus says, I can give you water that you never have to draw again. Think about that. That's crazy talk to her, because here she is every day carrying these buckets, filling up, bringing them back home. Then again the next day, over and over and over again. You're telling me there's water that I can get that I don't have to draw again? And she's got questions. She's listening. And they continue to talk about Jacob, who dug the well. And she's like, how can you be better than Jacob, our father, who dug this well generations ago? How can you be better than Jacob and give us water that we don't have to draw from anymore? And Jesus is like, I'm not really talking about water. She's not picking up on it yet. But we have the insight to be able to look into it and say, we know that Jesus is not purely talking about water here, is he? He's talking about grace. He's talking about grace that only he can give. And she's like, give me this water. I want this water. I don't want to have to come out here all the time. She's still thinking, not quite understanding the metaphor that Jesus is using of water. Now, I think evangelism or sharing our faith happens best through relationships. Jesus starts building this relationship all while showing her there's something better and more satisfying than this water that she has to come and get every single day. He was using this water to illustrate the grace which satisfies and sustains us, unlike this water that has to be gotten over and over and over again. God's grace sustains us in one drink, one belief, one understanding of the gospel. And not only that, water is frequently tied to the statutes and commandments of God in Jewish teaching tradition. So we could be seeing like Jesus, like a double metaphor, like Jesus offering the water, right, as better than law-keeping and rituals. She would have picked up on that as well. But either way, he uses the common need for water as a metaphor for a conversation. And Jesus takes that and he builds that relationship with her. It makes me wonder what's out there now today that we can use as a metaphor, as a common need to strike up a conversation with folks, to have a spiritual conversation. Maybe your neighbor needs help. Maybe your coworker is working on a project. Maybe your kid has an assignment due and you got to help them. How do we build relationships and how do we tie in the gospel to those conversations? And we can build relationships using so many ways. So after building a relationship, Jesus really gets to the heart of her story. It would be awesome, I think, if we could do what Jesus did and totally understand her story without having to hear it from her, right? I mean, Jesus did it. He just knew what was going on because he's God, right? Well, we're not God, but he knew enough just to go, can I meet your husband? And she's like, I don't have a husband. He's like, you're right. If you had 5 and the dude you're living with now, you're not even married to him. So we aren't a prophet and we aren't Jesus. We have to listen to folks. We have to hear their stories. Listening to folks takes time. It takes patience and typically more than one encounter. We can't get to the heart of folks' stories exactly like Jesus did in the same way, but he still gives us tools to listen and learn. It takes time to hear people's stories. Learning who people are and how God led them to where they are today is an important step in helping people see the grace of Jesus in their lives, even if they don't understand it. Even if they don't believe God had led them to where they are, we know it. We can see it. But what gets in the way of listening to people's stories? Maybe the busyness of life, technological distractions. Maybe it's never having learned how to really listen in the first place. How do you listen to people? There's gobs of articles on how to listen or how to get better at listening out there. But for our sake this morning, I'm looking at 3 ways we can be a better listener, in case you needed a self-help talk this morning. First one is eye contact. If you're all over the place while someone's talking, you're not really listening to them. Have you ever experienced that? You're talking to someone and they're looking somewhere else, maybe they're looking for someone else to talk to or someone better to talk to, right? I mean, it's super annoying and it's super offensive. And you're just you know what? I just want to stop talking to this person. Okay? So eye contact. Eye contact is really important. And then hearing the words and picturing what they're saying. This is going to help you actively listen to their stories and help you kind of walk a mile in their shoes and build up some empathy for their experiences. And then third, don't try to come up with solutions while they're talking. This is classic Dave Flug move, okay? I'll be listening to folks and I'm coming up with 3 steps you need to do to fix your problem. And that's it's all in my head while I'm listening, but I'm not really listening, am I? If I'm creating solutions while you're talking, I'm not really listening. So it's a really bad habit for listening, don't do it. But I do think we need to be able to hear folks' stories so we can speak the gospel truth into their lives. We need to be able to see what they've experienced, what their view of the world is, how they see how the world works, and what they believe to be true about it. Don't get me wrong, the gospel is one message. God sent his son to redeem people that he created who rebelled against him, who essentially are so sinful that we can't build a bridge back to God. So he sent his son, born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, to die in our place, a death that only we deserved. He didn't deserve it, we deserved it. But because of his great love for us and our inability to save ourselves or to make ourselves right with God, he took the punishment of death And not just like dying, but like the worst kind of dying. The kind of dying one does without God. The separation from God, the scary kind of death. But Jesus didn't stay dead. Instead, he conquered death, and he conquered the eternal consequences of sin. You see, if we take any part of that message, any part of that gospel message, if we take any piece of it out, it really isn't the gospel. It doesn't make sense. If Jesus didn't die in our place, if he wasn't substituted for us, then we are still in our sin. We're still stuck in our sin. If Jesus didn't raise from dead and conquer the consequences of the curse, then we are still stuck with those consequences of the curse. And even though this is one message, it is a singular message, it can speak into all aspects of our lives and meet each one of us right where we are. And we can take that message to those who are outside the faith, those who need Jesus, and speak the truth of the gospel into their lives. That's exactly what Jesus does here. He speaks truth into her life right where she's at. He takes the brokenness of her past relationships and uses those to show that there is a better way to live your life. But he doesn't just take the truth and like shove it down her throat. He uses something we like to call tact to convey the truth in a way that she will understand it. Like first he lets her ask questions and he doesn't condemn her for her questions. He's not like, well, that was a dumb question, but I'll answer it anyway, right? He lets her ask. And when he asks about her past and she finds out he's a prophet, she wants to ask all kinds of questions. But the one she really goes to is the glaring difference between him and her, the difference in faith systems. This is something most folks go to when they're encountered with the concept of faith. All kinds of questions come up when you talk about faith, like what's the difference between Catholics and Protestants? Or don't we all worship the same God, just in different ways? Like these are all valid questions, and her question is similar, right? She's asking like, we worship here on this mountain. We've set up this system of worship on Mount Gerizim, the Samaritans have. Like we worship here, but you Jews say worship is in Jerusalem at the temple. Which one is it? But Jesus answers her honestly and truthfully, and we must do the same with folks. But look how he answers the question. First he says, you know what? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you worship, because the time is coming when you'll worship not on this mountain or in Jerusalem. It seems like a cop-out, Jesus, right? You're like, it doesn't matter. But he doesn't stop there. He says, listen, you worship what you don't know. But we worship what we know because salvation is of the Jews. He then goes on to say again that it doesn't matter. Location will not matter soon, only the heart will matter. He answers her honestly and truthfully, and she just doesn't bail. Like think about it, she doesn't take off. He basically just told her that her entire system of worship is a farce. Her entire system of worship is made up. And she accepts the answer. Now, if he had done that without building a relationship first, there's a potential she would have blown him off as some kind of nut job. But she didn't. So let's take our example we got. Don't we all just worship the same God? Like that's a really good question because of the nature of the question. But the answer can be tough to hear. Because the answer is no. We don't all worship the same God. But we can't just say no. That's not sufficient enough, right? We have to explain why we say no. We need to help them see that that question actually insults each religion individually. That is an insulting question. Like their gods and gods don't work the same way ours does. They don't say the same things ours does. Our God doesn't make the same claims their God does and demands and et cetera on their followers. That's all different, radically different. To believe that we all worship the same God is disingenuous. And it shows that you really don't understand other cultures and their value and belief systems. Asking that question actually shows a lack of empathy, like a huge lack of empathy and understanding of what each religion believes. Like all that is true. But if I were to answer that way, void of any kind of relationship, it's gonna seem pretty harsh, right? Telling someone you basically don't know what you're asking, you're really unempathetic, you're disingenuous, those type of things. That's what that question is. Like if I answered that outside of a relationship with someone, it's gonna be harsh. But inside of a relationship where it's safe to talk about those things, where you've built something up, a rapport between the two people, it might not seem as harsh. In fact, it may seem gracious. This is one of my favorite stories in the Bible because it shows us how to interact with folks who don't believe and think the same way we do. Like, we have a tendency as a church, to churchy people, to focus on insiders, those who look like us, those who think like us. And we as a church can develop churchy language that only insiders can understand. Like think about things like fellowship. What distinct does that mean? Like if you go in your work and say, hey, we're gonna have some fellowship in the break room. Are you gonna say that? No, it's weird, right? Or like quiet time. Like time that I spend with Jesus in the Bible and scriptures, like try explaining quiet time to someone who's not a believer. Or praying for traveling mercies. What the heck? Or washed in the blood. Like, what the stink? Craziness. Communion. Try explaining communion to someone who didn't grow up in the church, who has no understanding what that is. That we take this like grape juice that represents Jesus, like drinking Jesus' blood. And then we also like take bread, which represents like tearing his flesh, and we eat that. And we remember like once a month, and we remember like outside of the context of understanding what those things are is super bizarre. And we have a whole host of other things that only insiders would understand. And it's not that they're bad things, like those are good things. But we need to understand it's insider language that leaves outsiders confused and feeling more outsiderish. So as we speak truth, we do so in a way that someone understands. We use everyday language to illustrate the gospel, like Jesus did with water. He just used something simple like water to illustrate the truth of the gospel in her life. There's so many opportunities to speak truth into people's lives, but I want to leave you with two more things. One is a warning and one is an encouragement. First, the warning: don't make people projects. Now, what I mean by that is don't build a relationship with someone in order to turn them into some spiritual project and get them saved. There's a couple of things wrong with that. First and foremost, none of us in this room save anything. We don't save. Jesus is the only one who saves. And so to think that I can get them saved that's not our role. Our role is not to save them. Our role is to share the gospel. God is the one who saves. And we are thankful, grateful to be used by him in a way just to share the gospel with folks. Second, people are valuable not because you build a relationship with them, but because we are all created in the image of God. We are all image bearers of God. Therefore, it isn't your relationship building that makes someone worth having a relationship with. It's not you. It all goes back to God making them worthy. They are worthy because they are created in the image of God. No one likes to find out they were some kind of project, right? It's the worst kind of feeling in the world. So if you're gonna build a relationship with someone, then do it for the sole sake that they are lovable because God loves them. And that's the only reason. So even if they decide not to trust in Jesus, even if they don't believe a thing you say about the gospel, you still love them for who they are, for who you know they are, for who you know they're created to be. Image bearers of God. Now for the encouragement. NorthPoint, there is a ton of people in this northwest corner of Des Moines that are outsiders. They don't know what church is. They've never been to one. They don't know why you get up on Sunday morning and go to the building on the corner of 162nd instead of sleeping in. But they need the gospel. They need the truth of the scriptures more than ever. And you have an opportunity to build a relationship with them so they can hear and see the truth of the gospel played out in your life. They're struggling with the exact same things you are. Health problems, raising kids, work, COVID, taking care of aging parents, and a plethora of other things. But they have no gospel framework to hang that on. They have no sense of eternity and how all that plays out in the big picture of the world. But the gospel answers all of those things. It speaks into each aspect of their lives, and they don't even know it. Look at the opportunity you have to build those relationships, hear folks' stories, and speak the truth of the gospel in their lives, and see if they respond or not. It never ceases to amaze me how God chooses us. Think about that. Us who have rebelled against God, who our very nature stands opposed to God. And I'm not like our sinful nature. I'm not talking about like the lie I said yesterday or the fact that I yelled at my kids last night or whatever it was. Like, I'm not even talking about that. Like, that's sin, but like, I'm talking about like the core of who we are is sinful. Like the very stuff that makes up our immaterial and material nature is corrupt by our sin. It is the very nature that Jesus saves us. He doesn't just save us from these little white, those are expressions of a core of sin in my life. Jesus saves that core. Jesus comes into our heart and transforms it. And then he chooses to use us to spread the gospel and grow his kingdom. Like, think about how amazing that is. So the last question is, are you willing to be used by him? Church, are you willing to be used by God to grow his kingdom? Let's pray.